friends, as you well know by now, we are in the middle of a series of lectures on poetry in the modern period in the 20th century, 20th and the 21st century. Maybe we will extend to that, and so far we have covered a number of poets from late 19th century up to the middle of the 20th century. And today's lecture by Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English in Hindu College, Delhi University, would be on W.H. Auden. I hope you have heard this name. This poet, W.H. Auden, came immediately after T.S. Eliot in the 20th century, and he was connected with universities, the university education, and for that reason he could well be equated with the university wits of Shakespeare's time, but he is more than that. He is a wit, but at the same time he is anti-conservatism, he is anti-ritual, and he is a modern poet in that true sense of the word. Now, before I request Dr. Bajaj to start a lecture, let me just pose a query regarding this poet as to his basic temperament. What is his temperament? Is he a witty poet? Is he an intellectual poet? And is it possible for a person to be a poet in the intellectual sense? Because mostly poetry is associated with sentiments, emotions, feelings, lyricism, all that. But this person is called an intellectual poet. So, would you agree?
I would agree, of course, in calling Auden an intellectual poet, but his biographer also called him raw and intense. So, I think before I add the adjective or a qualifier of an intellectual, I'd say he is raw and intense, and therefore he is also self-critical. Unlike many poets who'd who wouldn't go back on their words or who'd stick to their poetry even when it against this kind of a claim, he was one of those poets who didn't care about the reception of the a poem, but if he didn't like a poem, he would disown it, or he would show his disapproval. In fact, his best known poems, and one of them I'd be discussing today, September 1, 1939 and Spain 1937, both these poems he disapproved of and refused to put them in a collection later. Of course, they were together brought together in the Auden collection. But what I mean to say here is that Auden is a self-critical poet. He's raw and intense and a very passionate poet, and at the same time witty and intellectual. So, because there are so many areas that you can pin him down to, therefore he is also the most, I think, misunderstood, controversial poet of the time. Controversial also because he gives a lot of space to these critics to criticize him, because he himself is quite open-ended when it comes to his own poetic exercise, and he's constantly evolving, experimenting with forms and different genres, because he also understands that literature as he wants to portray, and his early works, he's tried to bring in a kind of a social ethos to his works, but very soon he realizes that this social message or social sort of ethos may not be put in a very straight-jacketed form, and in fact can very easily become a sort of a propaganda, which he obviously would try to distance himself from, so and therefore turn unpoetic. So I think to be able to put a social idea or to be able to write political poetry for a writer like Auden, I think it became difficult, because in poetry where instinct and spontaneity needs to be pronounced, there if you add a kind of a social practice, or if you add a kind of social dimension or aim to it, then there is a kind of a framework that you fall in, and which may render it unpoetic at times. So I think this is the problem that Auden faces while dealing with the genre of poetry. He's also a critic and a dramatist, right? So he's written a lot of essays, he gave a lot of lectures in his life that have turned into a book of criticism. But he's constantly experimenting with, I think, the poetic form during the period, and in that sense I think he falls in the right paradigm of the experimentalists of the 1920s or so, who tried to use the genre of poetry in a very different manner.
You seem to have indirectly accused him of being unpoetic by calling him self-critical and by raising certain questions, and that he gives credence to and preference to ideas than to feelings or lyricism. So do you own that particular charge that I lay at your door?
No, I don't think that I mean to say here that he is unpoetic, but he is definitely using poetry in a very different manner. He is definitely creating a different genre of poetry which can bring in the social ethos along with the experimentation with genre. What I mean to say is that he is also accused of being very he's politically right or talking about the health of society. Dylan Thomas called his poetry hygienic, because it tries to clean society of all its evils, and he says that I'd like to quote it in fact at some point where Dylan Thomas goes on to talk about Auden in this manner. So what I mean is, let me actually quote this one for you. He says, Dylan Thomas, who is a poet in his own right, he says, and I quote, he says, "I sometimes think of Mr. Auden's poetry as hygiene, a knowledge and practice based on a brilliantly prejudiced analysis of contemporary disorders, relating to the preservation and promotion of health, a sanitary science, and a flusher of melancholies," unquote. So he is, he's obviously he's taking a jibe, I think, here at Auden, but also suggesting that Auden is too mechanical when it comes to writing, and that he's probably using a kind of a technique, and he's a technical sort of a poet who's looking at the malaise in society and trying to flush it out or clean it. So critics are leveling this charge against him all the time. So I'm not suggesting that Auden is unpoetic. I'm suggesting that critics around him consider him to be unpoetic because he's not like T.S. Eliot, who's thinking of aesthetics all the time, but rather when the moment he puts this kind of poetry as a kind of poetry having a prophetic value, taking from Yeats for instance, Auden is seen as a kind of a poet who's trying to sanitize society. So, and Dylan Thomas calls this a sanitary science, his kind of poetry. So this is what I mean by the idea of unpoetic, which is a charge that is leveled against Auden.
Which are, according to him, the unhygienic aspects of modern society that is out to sanitize.
So of course, the idea being that he's talking about, again, what I find here in Dylan Thomas's quote here, also problematic, is that he says that his knowledge and practice is based on a brilliantly prejudiced analysis of contemporary disorders.
Can you comment on this? Brilliantly prejudiced?
Yeah, right. What I mean is, first, he agrees that there is disorder in society and that there is contemporary disorder, but he believes that Auden's knowledge and Auden's practice is based on this prejudiced analysis, brilliant prejudice. Why brilliantly? Because it is exercised with all its exuberance and exercised with all its ornamentation, etc. That he's able. You see, Auden is genius when it comes to using the poetic form. He can exercise the poetic form. He can use a lot of. He's very fond of using rhymes, alliterations, and different styles. So he's able to use that in poetry as well. So, but Dylan Thomas calls it a prejudiced analysis of contemporary disorders. Now, according to Dylan Thomas, then Auden's analysis is prejudiced, which is of course a reference to his very socially committed or a very Marxist sort of a understanding or Marxist analysis of contemporary disorders, because Auden, if you look at his poems, he would often talk about the individual, but very soon move to the culprits who are to be blamed, and move to imperialism, for instance, and talk about how imperialism is the real culprit and things. So and the moment he stretches there, I think this is what Dylan Thomas finds prejudiced, right? But then the question is, what is not prejudiced in that sense? Is it less prejudiced what Dylan Thomas does in his own analysis? What I find is that it's very strange that Auden has been a target of several critics. For instance, there have been such Dylan Thomas is of course one of them, but he's more witty and humorous when he's dealing with Auden.
He might even be supporting him.
Yeah, he was. It's not like he was against Auden. He in fact have recited a lot of poems of Auden. So he was also paying a tribute to him, but obviously in his humorous manner. But what I'm trying to say is that there is a kind of a prejudice of critics against Auden at the time. And a most stark example would be probably this critic who's Edgar Rickwood, who in his
really?
Yeah.
He's a Marxist himself.
Right. So when he comes to talk about Auden and politics, he says, and this is what he says about Auden's work, he says that Auden's work is an expression of the feeling of insecurity that afflicts a section of the middle classes, as the ceaseless concentration of capital into a fewer hands undermines their comparative privileged position. Now, what is really,
I wonder who is confused.
Yeah, right. So the idea is that, no, what I mean to say here is that Auden seems to be in the middle of all these controversies, and when talking about Auden and politics, Rickwood seems to be suggesting here that there is a feeling of insecurity that afflicts the section of middle classes, which is actually looking at the ceaseless concentration of capital in the hands of the fewer hands, which actually undermines their comparative privileged position. So again, it's a very queer situation, right? That the anti-Marxists are criticizing you and the Marxists are criticizing you equally for who you are. So you don't know where you stand, right? Because in Auden's case, what Rickwood sees him as a kind of a privileged position that Auden comes from, while Dylan Thomas is criticizing him for becoming this kind of a messiah or a kind of flusher of problems, socially sanitized
hygiene worker,
or a kind of making society healthy, socially healthy, or talking about imperialism. So hence the confusion and the controversies that arise. I mean, if you just go out looking at Auden's works, you'll find more criticism on Auden than his actual poems. Even if you surf online, you'll find more criticism on Auden than his actual poems. So this is what makes it both controversial, but I'd say also very interesting area for us to deal with.
So friends, I believe that if Auden is controversial in the 1930s, he is no less controversial in this discussion.
Yes.
It has already begun.
Because he is a political poet, I think, but he's also a poet. Being a poet, he is not going to follow.
That's a good point.
He's not going to follow any propaganda or a set rule pattern, or he's not going to follow a manifesto. Right? He's political, but he's also a poet. So when poets look at him, they see the political in him. When political people look at him, they only see the poet in him. So I think there is this problem that exists, and Auden was so open about his own exercise. He would criticize himself. He's very natural in that sense. He's witty. I would say maybe, I don't know, do you think it's a strategy that he uses to become controversial? He wants to be in the news?
Definitely he starts a new debate in English poetry. English poetry has been too dull, too prosaic, around that time. He's a poet of the 1930s. And if somebody raises questions and people start talking about it, even though they are attacking for that, then I think Auden's purpose is served. So he might have a strategy, one doesn't know.
Yeah, because he's known as the poet of the 1930s, which means these are they call themselves the Auden group. He led a pack of these youngsters who came together under his wings, and he was shepherding them, but also working together as a kind of a group. So with Louis MacNeice, for instance, and Stephen Spender. So what I mean is that 1930s is the decade where you see this Auden group bloom, where this guy, and there is a reason why Auden is also called a pink poet in that sense, because he has shades of the red, but he's not really so. So I think there is this kind of a very interesting decade in England, also because remember this is the Great Depression period when Auden's rising to fame, and he rises to fame in the 1930s based on the series of plays that he writes. I mean, they probably at some point in time we should also look at him as a playwright, because he rose to fame as when he wrote these leftist sort of plays in the 1930s. This is when he became popular. In fact, T.S. Eliot published one of his plays in the Criterion early on, and he was established as a writer. So what I mean to say here is that the decade of the 1930s then is important because it is one during the interwar periods, and two, it is during the Great Depression period, and it is at in this particular time when Auden turns political. I was also thinking maybe it is natural for the writers at that time to turn political because historically they are necessitated to talk about things, to talk about people's rights, to talk about injustices, to talk about concentration of wealth in the hands of few. So I think these topics were in demand. So maybe that's why he was also spending a lot of time writing about it. And the moment, by the time he writes 1939, September 1939, the poem, which again establishes him and as a poet, I think by that time he's already a kind of a refined, political, passionate sort of a left writer.
What does a poet become in his hands in the 1930s then? Does it remain a poem? Does it become a political statement? Does it become an extension of ideas?
So, Auden was influenced by both Marx and Freud. Very interestingly. So, you'd find that he tried to combine the external reality with the individual. So, quite I read he is also quite Dostoevsky in that sense as a poet. His sensibility, was dark and raw and intense, again would go again with his characteristic. But he also understood that the individual psyche was equally important, given the kind of influence. He in fact wrote an elegy for Freud in memory of Sigmund Freud as one of his poems. So, he wrote that as a way of paying tribute to Freud, but in his poetry, as you see how it takes shape, is that the external circumstance is combined with the inner psyche of the of the subject, of the poetic subject, or the characters in the poem, whichever whatever is at the center of the poem. So I think that Auden is able to combine or at least bring together these two distant points, these two parallels. He is able to find a point of reference where they come together and they seem to make sense together. What is the impact of the external world on the psyche of the individual? So I think he goes back and forth between the psyche of the individual and the world outside, right, and picks up different references and then puts them together in poetry. So yes, there are statements as prosaic, I would say, as any essay kind would have, and yet there are poetic flights where he moves into a kind of a dream or a kind of a daydream and enters different worlds at the same time, different landscapes at the same time, and weaves a pattern there where the statement then reflects on this kind of a exercise of stream of consciousness. So I think that's what you find in his poetry, at least of this kind, of this variety. He's also a love poet in that sense. Very well known poems such as The Lullaby, for instance, place him as a kind of a poet of love, where he's referring to time and eternity, or referring to the transient nature of love and how the poet wants to keep intact, and the poet actually prizes this kind of love emotion over everything else. So I think he's if you look at his as an anti-war poet, then these are the ways you can look at him. But you can also look at him as a kind of a love poet who would write poems like Lullaby, or even poems like Funeral Blues, etc. Then the poet here, unlike his political works, then such poems actually are deeply personal and introspective, you find. And a poet capriciously writes, for instance, in the Lullaby, lay your sleeping head, my love, human, on my faithless arm. So suggesting that human is prone to error, human is not necessarily virtuous, human is not necessarily normative. And I think that's what Auden is. Auden is constantly trying to break normative structures of society and things that we take civil code of conduct. I think how we behave in civil society, I think he tried to break all these barricades, also because he was trying to deal as a young boy, he was trying to deal with the question of sexuality for himself and his preference for men, and this kind of sexuality that he was developing, it did not fit in at the time with the regular normative structures. And so obviously he felt sidelined and he felt often stifled because he could never express his emotions. He married very early on in 1935. He married the daughter of Thomas Mann, Erica Mann. But then there was a marriage of convenience, and he very soon had different partners who were men, and he had these affairs with different men at different points in time. So I think as a love poet, he is constantly also trying to break the barriers of heterosexual normative relationships, and trying to also talk about the very beautiful aspect of love and living, that is very much there in Lullaby. And such poems actually also they capture the vulnerability of the poet. The vulnerability of the poet is also the longing that comes along with human relationships. So he is at one level talking about these relationships, where he's also talking about the enduring nature of love, for instance, in the midst of crisis, in the midst of these different changes that take place in society. So I think when you look at him as a love poet, then these are the points of reference. But because today I want to spend more time on him as an anti-war poet, I would be taking up for analysis the two poems, that is The Age of Anxiety and September 1, 1939. So just to give an overview of Auden in terms of his work and his perspective.
I'm already curious about 1939.
Yeah. So, well, this poem of course was written soon after Germany invaded Poland. So this is the first day of attack, and very soon this is going to turn into a kind of a mayhem. The whole scene would turn into a kind of a war situation, and the world would be on the path of war. So it is published. It was written in 1939 itself and published in one of the magazines in October 1939, but then published in his collection Another Time, which came out in 1940. And the title, of course, as I said, refers to the World War II and captures the response of the poet to the growing frenzy around him and the obsession of the war. So the poem actually begins with this kind of the poet himself, so notice how this poem also goes from the individual to the outside world, and it begins with the poet sitting in a bar on 52nd Street, and he says, uncertain and afraid, right? Those are the points that's what he says. I sit in one of the dives on 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid, as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. Waves of anger and fear circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth, obsessing our private lives. The unmentionable odor of death offends the September night. Unquote. Now, this is the mood at the time, this is the mood of the poet, and there is a sense of immediacy right in the very first stanza of the poem, I think, where the poet evokes the here and now. It's September 1, 1939, he's very specific, and within that also he's also referring to the September night, that is that, it's night, and this is an actual, the actual scene was that he was actually sitting in a bar and listening to the radio news, when in the news it came, it was declared that the war is open and that Germany has invaded Poland and the kind of devastation that is caused because of it. So it was a response to this news that he heard over the radio. Now, but there is a sense of immediacy in the poem, because the poem talks about the very present moment in time, referring to the attack on Poland and the war on an uncontrollable sort of path, this frenzy, and he talks about the bright and the darkened lands of the earth, and the bright and the darkened may refer to the countries on one hand, the countries that hold enlightenment values, democracy and others, while on the other hand the darkened lands could refer to places which are going over this kind of blind obsession and prejudice, obviously referring to fascism and Nazism in the world. So there is a sense of there is identifying the problem, that there is blind prejudice on one hand and there is enlightenment values of the past that have been negated. So when he says that he's uncertain and afraid, then it's a very individual emotion, that is a felt emotion of the poet at the larger happening around. So he is, it is how he responds to the problem, to a happening that is affecting all of them alike, right? And so, and the moment it's uncertain and afraid, which is very individual centric emotion, he turns it into a low, dishonest decade. The moment you turn something into a decade.
Can you comment on this particular expression?
Yes, the moment you turn it into a decade, you've brought history into it, right? You've distanced. So the uncertain, afraid I has distanced itself, or is looking at the decade as an observer then. And when he looks at the decade, then he's looking at the entire historical period, and how he defines it is a low, dishonest decade. Now, what is that decade? The decade has seen the, Spain, right? All the violence in Spain that has already, where human beings have proved themselves to be barbaric, right? So already in Spain, he has, when Auden actually volunteered to be an ambulance driver in the Spanish Civil War. And during this period, so his response to Spain 1937 is the period that he saw where human beings could turn into animals, and this kind of wave of anger and fear is what he had already seen in Spain. So Spain had already seen, and 1939 sends shiver down his spine, because he's already seen that kind of violence in Spain. Before that, of course, the entire period of the 1930s has seen the Great Depression set in. It is also the period which is also recovering from the First World War while you are in England. So also the movement towards right-wing politics in England, right? So all these are references to what he considers low, dishonest in his terms. How would you react to it?
No, this is a very serious poem that you are referring to, and he's as you have suggested, there is a kind of bridge that he wants to become between the outer world and his own individual self.
Right.
And that bridge is uncertain, and that the bridge is shaking. And it is shaking not because there is any problem with him, but because there are pressures from outside.
Right.
I agree with your analysis.
Yes. So how he's connected the individual with the decade, and with that he's a part of it. And waves of anger and fear, they circulate over the bright and darkened lands of the earth. So once again, we are in the midst of that wave of fear and anger, obsessing our private lives. Now again, the private and the political, they come in, that we obsess over private lives without thinking about the political, the public, right? And we are concerned about our private lives. I think, do you see it as also a kind of critique of modernist poetry at the time, say of the 1920s or so, where the poet would delve on issues that are too private, and where the individual is incapacitated, and the individual is only thinking about one's own personal life and obsessing about it? And is he in a way suggesting that it is our problem that we've turned a blind eye to this, and because we have obsessed our private lives?
I personally believe that Auden is a poet of irony. So even if he doesn't say this, he actually takes a position that casts aspersions on the existing modern poetry.
Right.
Because he's saying that they call it a private self, and they don't want to make any statement in public in their poetry.
Right.
That is wrong. That's the kind of criticism that he's making, but indirectly, in the ironical sense.
Right.
And that makes it much more deadly than if he had criticized them openly.
Right. Also, Auden is born in 1907, so as a child, he has seen the World War. In fact, his father was a physician who helped, the army in the First World War. So he has seen that kind of violence once, and when the moment he mentions the unmentionable odor of death, it's like a kind of a childhood trauma that he's probably also referring to. The odor of death that he now recognizes all too well is already looming large before the poet.
And see the use of the word, the phrase unmentionable odor of death.
Right.
That kind of very alert phrase that lays open the reality of the war.
Right. So I think the odor of death also is a kind of a reminiscence. You see, the odor is of death refers to something that you probably have in your head, a kind of a memory, you know, of something. And he can also, it's a kind of a cumulative sort of a comment on, I think, both wars together and what they lead to. I mean, it's like you've already seen what was First World War did and what it does to people with amputated and dead bodies, and the odor of death returning in this form can only mean this kind of an obsession and rage, because it cannot be rationalized in any way. So I think this is how I see the poem.
So friends, Dr. Richa Bajaj has talked about the general essence of poetry in the 1930s in the hands of W.H. Auden, but it has become a whole argument in the discussion, and already you have seen a kind of an interpretation of the poem 1939. So in the following discussion, another poem might be taken, or the present poem also can be elaborated upon further. Thank you.